the old Cuba Club. Miami, Florida and Havana, Cuba. The Palace of the Captains General, in Havana's Arms Square. A presentation by Calliope Enterprises and Armando Ruiz. This material is presented for entirely non-profit and educational purposes. There is no reason to believe that the featured images and music will in any way negatively affect the market value of the copyrighted works. For these reasons, we believe that this work is clearly covered under the current fair use copyright laws. The music includes selections performed by the National Symphony Orchestra of Cuba, the Camerata Romeo Female String Orchestra of Cuba, Marilyn Irby, and the Chamber Orchestra of Florida, the Winston-Salem Youth Orchestra, under the direction of Senator Romeo, and the Symphony Orchestra of the Cuban Superior Institute of Art. From the Armando Ruiz record and tape collection. Arms Square. It is the oldest square in Havana. It is the historic center of the city. It was built in 1559, between the main parochial church and the castle of the Royal Force. A few years later, in 1589, the square was already the current size and was the center of civic life. It is surrounded by palm trees, and in its center, there's a small garden with a statue. In 1834 the statue was of the King Fernando VII. Later it was changed by one of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, leader of the War of Independence in the 19th century. In this square, the Parroquial Mayor Church of the town of San Cristobal of Havana, which no longer exists, was located. It received the name of Major Parish because it lodged remarkable works and sculptures. The church, had been burned by the pirate Jacques de Sores in 1555. Later, it was restored and enlarged in 1666, with a nave, high and low choir, a sacristy and a tower. Unfortunately, the parish church was seriously damaged in 1731 with the explosion of the ship Invincible in the port channel. Attempts were made to repair it for 3 decades, but in 1776 the building was finally demolished and the church moved to the Order of Jesus. Later all its contents became part of the Cathedral of Havana, which was already built. On its grounds stands the Palace of the Captains General currently. In the Arms Square you can visit, in order of importance, the Palace of the Captains General, the Palace of the Second Lieutenant, the Castle of the Royal Force, the Palace of the Counts of Santovenia, today the Hotel Santa Isabel, the Little Temple, and the National Museum of Natural History. The Royal Force Castle, today, also serves as the Maritime Museum of Havana. The Palace of the Second Lieutenant was built in 1772. The Hotel Santa Isabel is former Palace of the Counts of Santovenia. It was built in 1784. The Little Temple of Habana is a small temple built in 1821 to commemorate the first Catholic Mass in Havana in 1519. Its interior is decorated with the paintings of the French painter Jean-Baptiste Vermeer. the National Museum of Natural History. The Fountain of Neptune was inaugurated in 1839. It is currently located in the far eastern side of the square, next to the Bay of Havana, in front of the castle of the Real Fuerza. Made of white, Carrara marble, and imported from Généraux, Italy, it is a beautiful work that radiates its surroundings with beauty and splendor. The Palace of the Captain Generals. Since 1968, this palace is the museum of the city. It was built in 1791 on the site of the old Parroquial Mayor church. Until 1898 it was the seat of the Spanish colonial government, formed by 65 Captains Generales, which gives the name to the palace. Between 1899 and 1902 it was the headquarters of the intervention of the United States. And finally, during some years of the Republic, 1902 to 1920, it was the presidential palace. During the time of the Marquis of La Tour, upon the rubble of the parish church, the construction of the government house was begun in 1776. It concluded in 1792, under the government of Don Luis de las Casas, becoming the residence of the colonial governors of Cuba. It is mainly in the Baroque style with Renaissance reminiscences. Its design is due to the powerful personality and taste of Colonel Antonio Fernández de Tripijos and Zaldívar, engineer, with the collaboration of Havana architect Pedro Medina. Because of its importance to the crown, almost all the materials with which it was built were imported: bricks from Malaga, marble from Généraux, and iron from Bilbao. The 10 columns of its portal were carved from stone. They form 9 equal arches. The ones on the main entrance are covered with Carrara marble. On them sits the royal Spanish crown with the coat of arms and the knightly order necklace of the Golden Fleece. The building occupies the entire block, and it is considered one of the most important Baroque works in Cuba. More than 40 exhibitions within the palace bring us closer to characters, costumes, and events in the history of the nation. This palace transports us to stately times through its interior spaces and national heritage collections. We approach the luxury of the wealthy Spanish and Creole social classes, and the extensive Cuban Spanish nobility that inhabited the country. You will be surprised by the wooden paving of the street that accesses the building. The wooden street is unique in the city. The wooden pavers were placed to minimize the noise of the carriages passing by. The Captain General of Cuba, from 1790 to 1796, was Don Luis de las Casas, Count of Aranda. Governor and Captain General of Cuba, Governor of Louisiana and Florida. He was the first to reside in the palace and the one who decided to replace the stone pavers with wooden pavers. As a good Basque, he had good and clear ideas. He improved Cuba's economy by introducing innovations in the sugarcane cultivation and carried out very important urban works in Havana and other cities of Cuba. Through the large wooden doors we gain access to the central patio, which is decorated with exotic shrubbery and 2 royal palms. In 1862, the statue of Christopher Columbus was placed in the center of the patio. A colonnade of arches on the 2 floors surrounds the patio. The palace has a ground floor and upper floor with great high ceilings, but there's an additional floor with a lower ceiling between them on part of the building. The place reveals the majesty and opulence of the Cuba of the time. To visit the Palace of the Captains Generals is to go back to a space of magic and dream, where the colonial parties that received the social life of the time took place. Upon entering these rooms we can imagine the receptions and celebrations that were given, the dazzling dresses of the jeweled ladies and the velvety costumes of the gentlemen. Accessible by the great marble staircase, the upper floor of the building leaves us dazzled by its exuberance and majesty. On this floor there are different rooms of the palace, set in traditional palatial style. The Hall of Mirrors, decorated by Venetian mirrors, it's where the transfer of powers from Spain to the United States took place on January 1st, 1899. We can appreciate in these halls the medallion furniture from the Elizabethan period, oil paintings by artists of the time, statues and busts in marble, French porcelain, sumptuous works of art that show the refined tastes of the different residents of the palace. The White Living Room is decorated with Louis XIV and Louis XV style furniture and European porcelains. Among them are several Meissen porcelain vases from the 18th century. The walls of the dining room are decorated with flamenco tapestries from the 16th and 18th centuries. We find among the luxurious tableware many original pieces that belong to the general captaincy and silver and copper trays. In the Infanta bedroom, the furniture was designed by John Henry Belter. There are two vases made with the cloison technique. We also find the gifts that the Infanta Eulalia de Bourbon received from the Havana aristocracy during her stay in 1893. the Infanta Eulalia, in the center of the photo next to her husband the Duke of Galera. Behind them, Don Alejandro Rodriguez Alias, Captain General and Governor of Cuba. The room of greater importance is the room of the throne. It imitates the style of the one in the Royal Palace of Madrid, and it was conceived to receive King Carlos IV and successive monarchs. In this room the most valuable works are exhibited, with paintings by the Spanish painter Federico Madrazo. The previous kings of Spain, Juan Carlos and Sofia, visited the room in 1997, on the occasion of the 7th Ibero-American Summit, but the king never occupied the throne of the hall as it was not a state visit. Portrait of Isabel II by Federico Madrazo Kuntz, Throne Room. No doubt, where the most mundane of us discover opulence is in the Hall of Baths, which show two bathtubs carved from Italian marble in the form of conchas or gondolas, accompanied by the rest of the bathroom utensils, French glassware and pieces by Cuban silversmiths and other valuables. The rooms on the ground floor are dedicated to various themes, highlighting religious art, with original pieces mainly from the Parroquial Mayor Church of the town of San Cristobal of Havana. In this room are exhibited marble pieces that adorned squares, promenades and gardens of Havana. They are a testament to the economic development of the time. The Hall of Flags. In the Hall of Uniforms, Flags and Armaments of Spain, garments worn by Spanish soldiers are displayed. Also decorations, canes, flags and banners of different groups of the Spanish colonial army. The good state of conservation of weapons and equipment is impressive. These white weapons and the immense pieces of artillery were occupied by the colonial forces. The thought room, and the Hall of Flags are dedicated to the memory of the Cuban struggle for independence. Some of the most outstanding Cuban thinkers are painted and portraits placed on the walls. The flags shown are considered national treasures. Personal objects of the leaders of the wars of independence are also exhibited here. The Spanish flag returns to the palace. The Spanish flag was retired when Cuba became a republic in 1902. Recently, the flag returned to the palace as a gesture of the unity and identification that Cubans have historically felt toward the motherland. We end our visit at the old garages of the palace, where there is an exhibition of carriages from the 19th century, uniforms of coachmen, and other objects available to passengers of the time. We thank you for visiting this grand aristocratic palace of Havana. It is one of the many impressive sights to be found in this 500-year-old city and testament to the glorious Spanish and European heritage of the island nation of Cuba.